Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm reviewing something a little interesting today, and that is the first of the two unaired pilots made back in the 60s for the hit sitcom The Munsters. This is of course the first My Fair Monster that was filmed in color, so it's a little different there. And it has a couple of our everyday cast members from the show, but with the addition of Joan Marshall as not Lily, but Phoebe. Before I get too far into it, just a reminder, if you want to support the channel, both the Patreon and PayPal links are down below. You want to continuously support the channel, subscribe to the Patreon. You'll gain access to videos like this early, and you'll also be able to suggest a topic for future videos. And if you just want to do one-off, go the PayPal route. Either way, your support is appreciated. Now, before I get too far into discussing this specific episode itself, I think I should probably explain what a pilot is for those of you who are not in the know. For those of you who haven't watched my Everybody Loves Raymond review series or never saw Pulp Fiction, a pilot is an initial episode of a TV show that the studios produce, or should I say the producers produce, in order to sell it to the television networks. And then based on the strength of that one episode, they decide whether they want to make more. Now, obviously, more pilots are produced as a pilot than are picked up as a show and go forward. In some instances, you're going to be like, really? That's the one that was picked? And then when you look at all the ones that weren't, you're like, that would have been an interesting concept. That would have been an interesting concept. And other ones, you're like, yeah, I could see why that one wasn't picked. In other instances, you look at the pilot and you're like, oh, so that's what the original concept was. Interesting. This is one of those times. Because in more recent times, the pilot, depending on the show, usually doesn't get too much changed and will usually be shown verbatim as the first episode. Like Everybody Loves Raymond, that first episode called Pilot, that was the pilot. Now, like I just mentioned, the fun thing is to see how it goes from the pilot concept to the final concept. Like with Raymond, obviously the set design changed because they got a more permanent set. We lost a character of Leo in the translation from pilot to full show. And, of course, because he thought it'd be a little too weird to have all three of his fictional children have the same names of his real-life children, the twins got, whether you look at it as a promotion or a demotion is going to be on you, they got changed over from Gregory and Matthew to Michael and Jeffrey. Now, here, the wholesale concept and the amount of characters is more or less the same. It is essentially, if you were to take characters based off the classic Universal monsters, tweak it a bit, and put them into the average sitcom setting, and let a lot of the humor come from the fact that it is a bunch of monsters in suburbia. And with how they're played, usually they're played a little straight by the cast, just with a little bit of that flair and the dialogue to match, thinking they're not the ones who are strange. You get a lot of the humor and the charm of the show. Of course, you got Fred Gwynne playing Herman Munster, Al Lewis playing Grandpa, Beverly Owen playing Marilyn Munster, and that's where some of the other humor comes, because she's the only one of the family that does not look strange, but they treat her like she does look strange. But if you're born into a family of monsters where you think that that is the norm and then you look normal, of course you're going to think that. I'll say at least the 90s show gave another reason other than just freak genetics for it to occur, but that's a different timeline, especially from this one. Now, as I mentioned, we got Joan Marshall playing the wife character named Phoebe in this pilot. Like I said, this is the initial concept, so there's still plenty of rooms to tweak it. Now, it's called My Fair Munster, and from what I looked at, one of the first episodes when the show actually was picked up has the same concept. But this is a pilot that runs half the length, so they definitely just produced this just to show the concept and not have a full episode. Get the characters set up and shown. Now, like I mentioned when I reviewed Rob Zombie's Munsters, I did grow up with this show. It's been years since I've watched a lot of the episodes, because I don't even remember the last time the show was in syndication where I actually watched it. I think that was last time it was on Nick at Night, which had been probably late 90s, early 2000s-ish. I remember enjoying it. I don't know if I saw a lot of the episodes in order, so that I cannot speak. I just have a lot of brief flashes of the show, like one episode where Grandpa steals Herman's pancakes at the very end because him wanting more. Now, the cast, you can already tell, do have some chemistry. Fred and Al do have a little bit of chemistry, even though there's not a lot to go off of. Joan would have been interesting as the wife, but she doesn't have the same chemistry with Fred and Al that her replacement Yvonne DiCarlo does. And Yvonne has more of a screen presence, whereas Joan is more demure. That might have changed when the series was picked up and they had more character development, more to work with. But it also doesn't help that in the makeup that they went with, Joan looks a little bit too similar to Morticia from the Addams Family. I mean, even without knowing about the Addams Family, you look at her and you're like, why does she look so familiar? So I can see why they did it. And another little interesting thing about this pilot is that it's filmed in color. Now, I can see from a cost perspective why when they actually picked up the show, they decided to film in black and white, cheaper at the time. Plus the fact that's more of a loving tribute to the original Universal films, which were filmed in color. And you could probably get away with a little bit more in black and white. More so nowadays if you were to do the filming, but back then especially. Especially with the TV budget, where you can hide certain things with the lighting. Certain things might not come off as cheesy in black and white as they would in color. And then all the aesthetic would look better. But of course, looking at the makeup, you can see it is gray. Like I mentioned when I reviewed the Rob Zombie one, it's a little. He's supposed to be gray, but they went with green there. But I already gave my reason for why I think they went gray there. Green there. Just bringing up something. Now, like a good pilot is supposed to, this does set up all the tropes, all the character interactions that we're supposed to get going forward, and the relationships and all that. See, Herman, he is basically a Frankenstein monster-like being. He's the head of the family. He works. We get a little bit, he's a loving father and uncle. I mean, he loves Marilyn, but you can see that he doesn't really understand how to deal with her, because one, she's a older female that he just doesn't know how to handle because he doesn't have a daughter. Plus the fact, her condition, so he's trying the best he can, but just that one look when they look at him at one point where he's like, kind of tells you all you need to know. Fred was that good of an actor. And of course, his loving relationship with Phoebe. We get a little bit of that in the opening credits, which you can see the germ that would become the first opening credits when Beverly was still on the show there, especially the little gag where Grandpa tries to go bite his daughter and she's like, no. That's one of the things where Joan does fall a little bit short when you compare her later to Yvonne, because Yvonne has a little bit of the don't you dare, Yvonne has that, whereas Joan is like, really? And of course, Herman does get a good kiss from Phoebe in that opening thing, and then he gets a little smirk like, oh, right. Beverly's only in the opening scenes. The first scene, of course, establishes the whole pilot and be like, okay, this is creepy. Something's going to happen. And then when you see Herman, it goes from there. We get the whole little things involving her character, where she's the only normal one by looks in the family, but she is a Munster at heart. But she does feel for her situation and like, why does no one want to stay? Why am I got to be like that? I don't know how many of the episodes do have plots revolving around that, but it does spur the plot of this episode in mind, where they want to try to make her seem normal. But of course, the only way for her to do that, would, at least from their perspective, would be for her to look like everyone else, which of course cues Grandpa going into his laboratory and trying one of his experiments. Starts another trope there. Grandpa Dracula going into his lab and experimenting, and now Lewis plays it beautifully. And of course, some of the other tropes, him playing chess, and of course his bat assistant Igor, Eddie, Herman, and Phoebe, and this pilot's son, played by Nate Derman, who of course did not carry on into the pilot. He's a little bit more animalistic here, more a little bit wolf-like, and just the way that the dialogue is and the way he plays it off, they kind of made him more of a spoiled brat here. Like, you can't make me. You can't make me. I'm not going. Grandpa having to put his foot down with some magic. Drop that noose. A little bit of the dark humor there, but it's dark in the sense of being a noose, but you can kind of play it off a little bit since it's monsters trying to fit into suburbia. Like I mentioned before, the pilot's only about 15 minutes. So when you're watching it, it kind of cuts off in the middle of the plot. You're like, okay, Grandpa's doing this. Like, really? That was it? I don't know if that's all that was saved or if that's all that was shot. But when you look at it, is the fact they're just trying to sell the concept and set everything up so that the investors can look at it and go, yeah, we'll produce the show. You can see why. Plus, if the show got picked up, they could either film what was left of the script or resolve it in a later episode, which they did. I believe it was episode 2. You watch it, you could see why they decided to go black and white. You can see why they replaced Joan, and they carried forward. Of course, there's a little bit of a shame that Beverly later decided not to stay with the show. But her leaving and replaced with Pat is why we got that more iconic second opening with Herman busting through the door and he's like, you know, then Lily coming out, testing for rain, walking out, Grandpa coming with the shovel, and everyone else following. That's a way to welcome Pat into the show as the replacement Marilyn. There's not really much else to talk about with this pilot. If you are a fan of the Munsters and you haven't seen it, I'd say give it a watch, especially since there's a couple uploads of it on YouTube. That's how I watched it. And it's a little interesting, just like with any other pilot, to watch it and compare it to how the eventual show went. Now with me, I'm going based morely on memory and some of the clips I've watched over the last year just to see some of the big highlights of the show, because like I mentioned, I haven't sat down and watched a show in a row in a long time. If I eventually do, I don't know if I'll do a review series like I did with Raymond, but maybe. I mean, the show isn't as long as Raymond, so I could probably knock it out in a year if I did it episode to episode. Or maybe I'll just stop and just do a season one, but we'll see. That's about all I have to say about the pilot. Just, it gets the Mars stamp of approval for curiosity's sake. Till next time, guys.